In today's gospel, we hear the continuation of last week's gospel. The story of Jesus opening the Isaiah scroll in the synagogue of Nazareth and proclaiming that the words of Isaiah are being fulfilled at this time, in this place, in the people's hearing. Now, in Luke's take on this gospel, there is a detail that can be easily missed when we conflate his telling with those of Mark and Matthew. We tend to read it that it is the claim that Jesus is the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy that enrages his neighbors. That is not what the Gospel of Luke actually says. You see, the way Luke tells it, the impoverished people of Nazareth, a small, forgotten village with a few hundred residents in the occupied land of Galilee, just a couple miles from the Roman city of Sepphoris, and a few miles more from the Roman resort city of Tiberias, when told that the words of Isaiah are being fulfilled, rejoice. They are shocked that the fulfillment is coming in the person of their own hometown son, but they are still excited to be freed from Roman occupation, from taxation that strengthened and enriched the Roman Empire and those who collaborated with it, and from debts that they would never repay. But then they ask for Jesus to prove who he is, that he is who he says he is, to do some miracles for them like he did in the larger towns of Capernaum. And instead of acquiescing, Jesus instead starts talking about the general Nahum and the widow of Zarephath, and how the prophets were never accepted as such in their own homes. It is only when Jesus says these things that things turn ugly, and they haul Jesus off the mountaintop to toss him off. Now, without knowing either of these stories, the sudden change in tone and attitude seems irrational. But when we look to these stories and hear what Jesus is saying from the point of view of the people of Nazareth, we can understand their anger. Naaman was a foreign general, commander of the army of the Aramaeans from modern Jordan. Throughout the period between the Exodus and the exile, Israel and Judah, whether as a loose confederation, a united kingdom, or a northern and southern kingdom, were under constant attack from the nations around them. Naaman was the leader of one of these nations. Under his leadership, the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered and occupied, and some of the residents were taken as slaves by the army, including a 10 to 15-year-old girl who was taken as a servant for his wife. Now, Naaman had some sort of skin disease that made his skin itchy or painful and subject to peeling. Not modern leprosy, but still a disease that made him ritually unclean and was unpleasant to experience. He had sought out any number of treatments for his condition, but he was always left disappointed. So when the girl who was enslaved by him sees him, she tells his wife that she knows someone who can cure him, the prophet Elisha. Now Naaman asked the king of the Aramaeans to command that he be shown to the prophet, and the king sends word to the king of Israel to command. Now I said king of Israel and mentioned occupation. The situation was much more akin to that of the Channel Islands under Nazi occupation than that of the French under the Vichy government. The king somewhat collaborated with the conquerors, but he was the legitimate king, and his main goal was to keep as many of his people safe and alive as he could, with the knowledge that if he did not make accommodations to the occupying army, the entire land could be razed and all of the people massacred. So when the king of Israel received this request, he was upset. He didn't know where Elisha was and certainly could not vouch for his ability to work this miracle. And if he could get him to do this, if he could not get him to do this, everyone was going to be in danger. So Elisha sends a message to the king to send Naaman to him. But then Elisha doesn't even bother to open the door when Naaman comes calling. He just sends a servant out to tell Naaman to go bathe 7 times in the river Jordan. Naaman is thrown into a rage. He starts storming around talking about destroying everything. How dared Elisha so disrespect him? But Naaman's advisor takes him aside and says to him, look, if Elisha had come out and made you participate in all kinds of crazy rituals, be bathed in cow's blood or walk on hot coals or whatever you would have done it and been satisfied, even if you were not cured. He is just asking that you go for a swim. You might as well try it. So Naaman does, and he is cured. Naaman is so impressed that on the spot he is converted and he packs up the army and heads home to Aramea. As in the story of the widow of Zarephath, there was a massive drought and famine throughout the Near East. People were dying in the streets in Israel and Judah. The prophets lived off the goodwill of others, but people did not have surplus to share. So Elijah is near death himself. So God sends Elijah to Zarephath and is told to seek out a specific widow. Elijah finds her, but she has only enough flour and oil to make a single piece of flatbread. Then there will be nothing left. She and her son will starve. But after explaining this, she nonetheless keeps the laws of hospitality to provide for the stranger and the foreigner. Miraculously, the flour canister never empties, and the oil jar never runs dry. The three, Elijah, the widow, and her son, survive the famine together. Later, the boy takes ill and dies, but then is raised from the dead by Elijah. Through the miracle of Elijah, the widow comes to believe in the one God and is converted to Judaism. Both stories echo throughout Luke. Jesus reenacts each of these miracles, but each time they are far grander than what the great prophets were able to accomplish. But back to the synagogue at Nazareth. When Jesus recalls these stories, what the people hear Jesus say is that God has deserted the people of Judah and Galilee and turned to other nations. But another way of hearing these stories is that through the sharing of the word and the one God of the nations comes true and lasting liberation. God does not desert Israel, Judah, or the Jewish people. God is always present, and the covenants made between God and God's people are irrevocable. But God's love is not exclusive. God's love is liberating. As Paul puts it, love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. And this is the message for us. We are called to love one another, even those who hurt us. So to be clear, this does not mean staying in abusive relationships. It does mean continuing to love those who hurt and disappoint us. It means helping them in ways that do not put our own lives and health in danger. And it means rejoicing with God when people's hearts and lives are transformed. Amen.